You aren't on in 5 minutes, and so yeah, we're live now with Tyler and Andrew. So yeah, we're having a lively discussion just before we start the show, and this was going to be a good one because we're going to think back. So Andrew, myself, and Tyler have all started businesses dealing with data analytics and Power BI and Python and all kinds of crazy fun stuff, and so this is being broadcast to YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And we have a couple of members. I know Deepali, I think, is joining us. Kenneth, Tyler, I think, signed up to join us. Nick, I think, was potentially going to join us too. He was on a live show. And we're all going to think back to when we tried to, load a large set of data and the roadblocks we ran into, right? So we want to, as an audience member, if you've ever had any of these fun experiences like we've had, where let's say you throw in a large set of data, you bring it up in Excel or Python or Power BI, and your computer just crashes, right? So we're going to talk about those experiences and what kept you going, right? And I think, Tyler, we're going to kick it off with a story that Tyler was just telling us about. So Tyler, if you want to kick this off. So Tyler, I invited him to the show. Actually, it was your idea to do the show. You posted it on Teams and you're like, yeah, what happens when how do people handle when they first bring up their large set of data? And then Tyler, I think you were like, well, I'm going to do some examples and I'm going to post stuff on the show and I'm going to show people as an example. But I think you ran into some issues that maybe some of our other members will experience. So yeah, let's kick it off with you, and we're already getting some comments in. So let's Tyler, if you can kind of walk through what happened this morning.
So apparently OneDrive does not like to go away. It is extremely difficult to get rid of a OneDrive file path. You have to modify the registry. You have to uninstall it. So I had a OneDrive link to my computer this morning that I could not get it to go away. I still had access to the files and all this kind of stuff. And so I kept trying to get rid of it. And finally, I just reset the whole computer, reloaded Windows, and now all my stuff is gone. So now I have to re-download Anaconda and all this stuff. So, and all of my data sets that I had stored in the cloud, and really quite unfortunate. It's going to be very useful this webcast, but apparently not.
So Tyler, wow, and we talked about this. This is so interesting because this reminds me of college, right? You get your files up there and you're typing along and you got like 10, 15 pages of this report, and all of a sudden something happens and boom, you're done, right? You're like, oh, all the files are gone and you got to start from scratch. And this brings back so many painful memories, but it still happens, right? To this day, you do something, and in Power BI, you make all these data connections, and you could potentially lose one of them, or, like in your case, it overtook your whole system and you couldn't get rid of it. Like that's kind of a unique one. I've never run into that, where you've got something like coming into your system that just kills you, that you can't get rid of unless you.
I think one of the other painful experiences is in Jupyter Lab. So you have a Python kernel running, or you have a Jupyter Lab kernel running, and all of a sudden you lose internet and you're training a model, and all of that's stored in RAM, in volatile memory. So bye-bye if you don't have all of that saved. And then you gotta retrain everything. It could be hours.
Yeah, so Tyler, this is
so demoralizing.
This is so many memories. So yeah, and I want to take this to a second comment that we were just kind of talking about too, is, with Power BI, I'm thinking back to when I first started with Power BI. I downloaded the desktop version. I was so excited. And I loaded, I think, a data set. And I had a Microsoft Surface with 8 gigs of RAM. And and then I tried to manipulate some of the data, do some transforms, and then I loaded it into the data model. And I remember it took, I don't know, it must have been close to 30 to 40 minutes, right? And I was like, what is going on? Like, why is this taking so long? And I think I learned the hard way that, Power BI does do a lot of it in memory, right? And there's a lot of compression and stuff. And so I went and I want to, this was life-changing, was I went and I purchased a Dell XPS 15 with 32 gigs of RAM. And that changed my life, right? When I went to that and I finally got enough memory, it started working, right? So I think there's audience members out there, and Raul, I see from Costa Rica, is chiming in. And he's chiming in, interestingly, to hear what other people are struggling with, because he's a Power BI professional too. So this leads into Andrew a little bit, who was just telling us he's worked with, I think, Panda, which I'm not as familiar with. But Andrew, you worked with Panda, and you actually had a 32 gig machine, and I think you said you crashed your machine.
Yeah. So Pandas is a Python library that can make working with data really, really easy. Yeah. And they've got a number of convenience things, like being able to read data directly from a SQL query. And I, through ignorance, wrote a very, very broad SQL query on a very, very large data set and tried to pull all of that into my machine, which you'd mentioned had 32 gigs, which is of RAM, which is, you don't really run into a lot of problems when you got 32 gigs on your computer. And it crashed it after trying to load data for an hour, and I didn't realize that's what had happened. I just thought my computer turned off for a power outage or something. So I did it not just one, but 2 more times before I realized what was going on. And then finally on that 4th time, when I finally debugged it, I had the Windows Task Manager open, watching my RAM just like fill up and start to get compressed, and then everything else started getting slow. And then I was like, I should probably look at my query, because that's the only way I'm going to be pulling in that much data. So yeah, wow. always mind your queries.
Yeah,
absolutely mind your queries.
Yeah, so fascinating. So and then I'm going to bring in one of the comments that Deepali, my intern at SolisMatica, made. Was she I don't know if you saw it, Tyler, but or Andrew, but she was using Python, I think, too, right? And I forget the format or the tool she was using, but she crashed it too. Are you guys familiar with the tool she was using?
I don't remember I don't remember what the comment exactly was.
Yeah, but
now I'm curious.
But so I'll look it up while we're looking. But this is funny. Like I started the show. I didn't think that it would be all about our computers crashing, even with 32 gigs. But that is the common thread, I think, is when you have this much data, you got to have the right tools and the right amount of memory, and watch your queries. That's an interesting one.
Absolutely.
So here's Deepali. I did the same thing. Try to join a query in Pandas on a very large data set. Jupyter,
yeah.
Okay, so Deepali is chiming in. And Deepali, Kenneth, or Raul, we got a lot of audience members today. So if you have any questions or have any experiences that you want to share, go ahead and chime in. And Kenneth is going to try to join us. So if you guys can keep the conversation going, I'm going to try to grab Kenneth and bring him on. He's out in California. He's a Power BI professional, and he comes from the SQL side of things. So so he's going to have some interesting insights, because he's one of these guys. So I see two routes, and this is one of the biggest tips is I see 2 routes typically come into Power BI. There's 3 routes now that I'm seeing, is people that come from the SQL background, and they're dealing with the snowflake schemas with multi-dimensions and sub-dimensions. Then we see the Excel people come in, and they are, that's where I came in from, and it's a flat file. And when I open up Power BI files from Excel people, I can tell right away because they're familiar with VLOOKUPs, and it's a huge flat file which takes forever to load into Power BI. So I think one of the biggest tips I have for people is convert it into a Star Schema and write your DAX measures to utilize the Star Schema, because that really in Power BI it utilizes the compression methods and takes that data model with millions of rows, and it just compresses it down to nothing. So so that's my top tip, I guess, when dealing with large data in Power BI. So Tyler, maybe we go to you, and thinking back, when you were first dealing with data, and maybe some of your initial struggles, right, with data. And just a quick story is I still remember Excel. When dealing with data sets, and what was nice about Power BI is you can build those relationships. Like I remember VLOOKUP from a one to many. Like you got a tab with many.
Oh my goodness.
And you were like, how do I connect with a VLOOKUP from one row to another tab with multiple rows? And I was racking my brain, right? With Power BI now, you just build a lookup table and do you do a connection, and it brings it all down. But maybe think back, go back a little bit. When was the first time you brought in a large data set, and what happened, right? So we'll go to Tyler for a second, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Yeah.
Charles, I'm not even old, and I don't even remember the last time I wrote a VLOOKUP. Like, it seems like decades ago.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing that I learned quickly was the allure of the constant connection to the database, right? So in Power BI or in Tableau, you have an ability to have a real-time connection with your database. Don't do that when you're prototyping and building out. It sounds really cool when you're new to the game, but load a sample of that in, build out your prototype, and kind of get your requirements down, and then you can have your real-time database connections when it's actually out there on the web and for people to consume, because it slows everything down. And I was a kid once, so
I wish
Tyler,
you told me that 2 weeks ago when I first tried using Power BI.
oh man, it's just too slow.
It's the first thing I did.
Oh my gosh, this brings back, I'm smiling and laughing because this is my biggest nightmare. Was when I was like, oh, auto refresh, direct query, boom, and then you're like, no, this takes forever. This is so complex. I can't do any of the work behind the scenes. So then, and I learned from Avi too, direct the import method, and then just bring it in and then work with the data and simplify it first. And then in the future, maybe build a composite model and do. But I get so many people that hear about the direct connection, and they're like, we want it direct. And then I have to ask, like, why? Do you really need it like on the fly, like update it all the time? Or can you do it once a day? And usually when you dig into that a little bit, you can update like maybe once a day or twice a day or whatever. So, oh my God, that is a huge tip. Start with the import method, manage your data first, simplify it first, and then move to, if you really need it, the auto refresh connections. So Andrew, I had to jump in. I was trying to get Kenneth onto the show, but that one just hit me hard because I was like, I have experienced that. So yeah, Andrew, you want to go?
Yeah, I feel like I shouldn't have fallen for the direct query trap, because the same sort of thing happens in machine learning. When you make a model, people want it to be a real-time model, right? Like they want to be able to put it on an endpoint and hit it at any time. And a lot of business applications, you're fine just doing it as a batched process on a nightly basis or an hourly basis or what have you. So real time is not always a good thing, because it creates so much operational complexity. And in this case, you were talking about slowing down your computer, which is a data professional's worst nightmare, maybe one of my worst nightmares. But yeah, the number one thing that I learned pretty early on in working with data is just doing very, very simple analysis of the data set can save you so much time down the line. So one of the tips that Charles and I have talked about before is instead of going after all of your data at once, just taking a small subset of it and working with that small subset to make all your connections. But when you're working with machine learning, that can also cause problems in and of itself, particularly when you have what's called an imbalanced data set. So if you're trying to do like classification and you have 10 different things that you're, say, trying to classify tweets as being about food, sports, or something of that nature, you can run into an instance where one category you're trying to classify for has very little data compared to the other ones. Now, if you take a small sample of that data, you might not actually end up getting any instances of one of those classes in your data set. And if you train your model up on that, it's just never going to classify that. So, I mean, there's all these different biases with how you collect your data and how you sample down your data. But just doing that high level analysis of, do I have balanced data? Do I have representative data for all these different ways I'm thinking about breaking down the problem to make it manageable? Can solve you a ton of headaches down the line.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Breaking down the data, understanding your data, simplifying the data right at the get-go. You know, and I'm going to add a tip is one of the first steps I do is I learned this from a friend of mine, Eamon Kelly, who's up in Toronto, and he's a Power BI specialist. But he takes, typically people send him flat files, CSV, he throws it in Excel, and then he takes the header rows and then the first like 5 rows, and then he does a transport or a transpose and pastes it into a second spreadsheet. And then he looks at the fields, and then he looks at, you know, a sampling of what the data looks like. And then, you know, and Sheri Enger is just on here too. And then the next thing I do is kind of think through, you know, kind of the data model in my head, or I actually draw it out now. So I take the transaction table, and it's typically a business process. So there's typically what's measured in the data table is time in between 2 steps or the cost of a certain step. So that's typically what happens. And then I ask the questions, and Sheri brought this up on our last call, is you know, you ask who made the transaction, what was transacted, who, what, when, where, why, and sometimes how is kind of a catch-all, right? And then when you go through that exercise, you know, your data model is put into a Star Schema, and then you understand your data a lot more because you're looking at the, you know, the field, the category, but you're looking at the individual information in the data, and it just, you understand your data a lot more. And the other thing, Andrew, along the lines of simplification is people, so I've seen this too. One of the tips I'm giving to the audience is people start out with like a snowflake schema, and they're like, oh, I gotta bring in all the data and flatten it into a single, you know, flat file, or, you know, build it out into a Star Schema. But what I typically do now is I pull out the transaction that I'm looking for, like timestamps or data, and I pull out one first. And then I pull and I connect potentially like a category, like a product category. So that's the what. And then I bring that into a Star Schema and lookup table. And then I take everything else and I unload it and delete it from my model. Not delete it, but I just hide everything so that I can just focus on that one dimension. And that one, you know, data transaction, and then that one dimension, and I get that to work first, and then I go into the next dimension, like the time stamp or whatever, and then with a calendar table, then I go into the location, you know, where was that transaction made, etc. So I try to focus with one data transaction table and then one lookup table first, and then expand on that, and that has worked wonders for me. You know, I can take really, really complex things and make it so simple that it's easy, and then scale off of that, right? So that's probably my one tip for everybody. And then thanks, Sheri. Sheri's on here commenting too. So she was talking about, you know, a couple weeks ago about how she uses the you know, who, what, when, where, why, builds out the data model first, and that just simplifies her life. But Tyler, so let's go into this. So I have kind of a 5-step process, and I'll follow you guys in terms of what I do. I pull up a data set and I take, kind of 5 steps to work through it, to simplify in my mind. One of the first step is transpose the data in another tab and look at what the data and the fields look like. And then I pull out all the information I don't need. That's the second step. So what do you have a process or steps that you recommend for people to take, that when they go through a new data set?
Yeah. So probably my first step is going to be starting with the query, right? I've gotten really good at combining SQL and Python now. So I write my query about as general as you can get it, to where you're not overloading your system. And once you've done that, then you can start doing your exploratory data analysis, or your EDA. And to me, as a data scientist, data analyst, business analyst, your EDA is where you're going to spend a good chunk of your time really discovering the weirdness in your data set, right? So after you've ingested everything, you start to really look at the nuances within your data set. Do I need to deduplicate, right? Because I have a lot of duplicate records, whereas I should only have one. Start looking for blanks in your data set. Do you have anything that is missing that shouldn't be missing? Start to understand the spread of your data. So I really like Seaborn's distribution plots. So you can start to really look at the distribution of your data. Do I have any big outliers? Is my data set fairly normal? Which in most data sets that I've ever worked with, there's never been a normal data set in my whole entire life. They're always oddly skewed in these random outliers. And so, and then go into like your box plots and just a very basic high level understanding of where your data is at, and start to investigate the contrast. One of the pieces of my training has been the idea of the REDX methodology. So the REDX methodology, or Shine-In, uses contrast in order to go out and find the highest levels of contrast within your data and start exploiting those pieces of contrast, and start to understand what is the difference between what you might deem as normal versus not normal. And once you've made those splits in your data, then you can start to deep dive and say, hey, is this something we can exclude from our data set? Is this something that we need more data on because it happens to be a normal part of the business process? And so then finally, after I've gone through that high level stuff, then I really start to build out, okay, what do I want my output to look like? Is this a dashboard that's going to go to Power BI or Tableau? Or is this going to end up in some sort of model where I need to actually begin brainstorming what model best fits the outcome we're looking to have, or the business process we're looking to automate, or whatever it is. So I think that's probably where I start, is getting the data in, making sure you have a good subset that encompasses the wider population, and then doing your exploratory data analysis and getting a really good understanding of that sample, and making sure you can describe it in words, basically.
Yeah, and that's super important. I know there's a whole movement to make, especially in Power BI, make it describable in words so somebody can look at your data model and understand what you're doing, instead of using the prior abbreviations that come out of the SQL world, like dim tables and stuff. And people that are just starting out is like, what is a dim table? And so these new models try to use very good words and descriptors to label each field, label the relationships and the steps taken to clean the model. And that's, I guess, another tip is to for the audience is document your steps, label them in something that makes sense to you, because I've had that so many times where I look back at a data model, it's like I should have labeled this something different, because what does this mean? So a lot of to unpack there. Thank you, Tyler. I'm going to have to come back and watch that section. That was great stuff. Is you're thinking how you go through it. I think that's going to have a lot of help, our audience members that are trying to analyze data for the first time. I'm going to bring in a couple comments. So Raul, our friend in Costa Rica, he's in my Avi Singh program for historical information, 15 years of transactions, split the data into first date up to last year and this year. The older data import at once and disable in the data refresh. So yeah, that's some good points, because a lot of times people bring in, there's like, hey, we took 15 minutes of every 15 minutes we took data and we have data from the last 30 years. And I'm like, do you really need all that, right? Let's simplify that. So I think Raul's point is, like, and Andrew, you have talked about this too, simplify it, maybe look at the first year first, build out kind of the queries and what you want to do with the data, and then start going back if you have an interest in older data, or do a sampling of the data, because you may not need every 15 minutes. You may just need a grouping of that data, maybe write a query to say, okay, give me the average every day or something, because 15 minutes, it's nice to have that granularity in the background. And I think Raul's point is you can always pull it in if you need for a certain period, that granularity, but you don't need it right off the bat, because it's kind of like the direct query thing, Tyler, that you're talking about. It's kind of overwhelming, right? You got so many rows and rows and rows of data, it'll just crash.
Some of that will be domain knowledge too, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't have domain knowledge in the space that you're working, go find someone, right, that can tell you what you should focus on and kind of what the requirements are.
Yeah. If somebody who's currently using that data doesn't really ever look back more than 3 months, then you probably don't need to start off with more than 3 months worth of data, because that's kind of matching at least the current process is usually a really good start for improving those processes, right?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. Is you really use the data that makes the most impact, has the most value right now. And when you need to, you can always go backwards if you. Kenneth, I sent you a link on LinkedIn to join the call, but it looks like you gotta go on a different call. But I'll follow up with Kenneth after. So Kenneth does some fascinating stuff with. He uses Power BI and increment, or uses Xbar R charts. So for manufacturing type of facilities.
Cool.
So he's found some plugins into Power BI that allows you to bring in Xbar R, implement Xbar R charts and see if your machine or process is in control. And, look for the trends where it's like, oh, it's going out of control, and spend money on those versus spending money all the time to fix stuff that's within the machine's capabilities, right? So, we've had some great discussions, Kenneth and I have, about, he's really trying to bring that back, because I think, people have moved away from control charts, and I think there's an importance there in learning what your machine and but he's got to go on another call. So I want to jump into something. So Tyler, you reminded me of something. Is a lot of times data is.
Oh, did we lose Charles?
We're losing Charles.
No.
And he had such a lead going in too. I'm not exactly sure where he was going with it, but maybe until he comes back, I'll describe a little bit about the process that I go through when I approach a problem or a project.
I've always been curious about this.
Yeah, I mean, you went into a lot of really good technical detail of like how you step through different stages of that project, and it just reminded me of that highly iterative nature of a data project, where as soon as you take some preconceived idea of what you want to do with the data and you start analyzing it, things change really, really fast. And so it's been sometimes a challenge working with a variety of clients to not let these projects become software projects, where it's like you can define requirements ahead of time and then meet those specs, right? Like, how good do you want your model to perform? That's really hard to describe. But so what I've done in my process with attacking these projects is I take a cue from lean startups. which is the build, measure, learn loop. And I try to organize my work around that loop, because in iterative projects like these, the tighter you can keep that loop, the smaller that loop is, the faster the overall project goes. So it starts off with asking yourself, what are we trying to learn from this data set? What do I need to use or to put together to measure that learning? And then finally, what do I have to build to get those measurements to learn what we're trying to go for? And just organizing the work around that in project reporting has been fantastic in communicating progress and when things need to start going in a different direction, because you land on this learning point and you say, this is what we learned. We think we should go learn these other things. And the progress then isn't measured by some preconceived sort of, we want to get this performance on this application. It becomes more of a guided learning process of everybody getting a better and better understanding of the benefits and the challenges that you have in the data set, which that sort of communication is always good between different levels of management and different domains, the different silos you have in a company.
Yeah, I two things. In my last role, we adapted a lot of our modeling and learning around the agile methodology. And I guess traditionally I maybe wouldn't have thought that machine learning or building out models couldn't really fit the agile method, just because it is so iterative, right? It's not as easy to say, I'm going to set out to go do this, and you realize halfway in the middle of your sprint, like, I'm not even close to working on that because I found some sort of data quality issue, right? So I think organizations are going to struggle with that because of the prevalence of agile methodologies, but now this oncoming craziness around machine learning and data analytics. And so we're going to try and shoehorn data analytics and machine learning into agile methods, and it's not always going to work. Yeah, it's a pain. And you're going to have to kind of adapt that thinking. We ended up making it work, but it was difficult. It wasn't as seamless, I'd say. And so you got to kind of fit that into your agile methods, is taking time out of each sprint to really hashing out in your process around figuring out what the data is about, and also making sure to split your data. I have a terrible habit of not splitting my data, and I am going to make sure that I do much better about that this year, because you can end up adding a lot of bias by not testing against a holdout set. If you're a data analyst and you're working with analyzing large data sets, split it up into what you're going to look at and then test against. It's so important to ensure you're not creating a bunch of leakage and adding bias to your analysis.
Yeah,
oh,
definitely.
Very cool. Hey guys, I'm back. My internet.
Welcome back to your show.
Yeah, welcome back. Yeah, you guys held your own. Like, that awesome job. Just with the show here. Thanks, Tyler and Andrew, for keeping things together, holding up the fort. It sounds like that you talked about an interesting point, and I want to reiterate is, and Tyler, you talked a little bit about it before I dropped off, but you have to look at what you want to get out of the data too, and every once in a while revisit. And this goes back to, I find this a lot too, is people have preconceived ideas about what they, we're going to save money and we're going to find this out, and this is the department that is slowing everything down. And they have their mindsets, right? And then you analyze the data and you're like, oh, well, here's a different direction. And look at over here. It's really this process that was broken. It's not really, we can't. So it's that idea of you don't know what you don't know. And then as you dig into the data, you take little steps and you almost want to revisit every couple of weeks. And I've run into this multiple times. And I guess that's one tip that I want, the audience members to recognize is, if you have preconceived biases and notions going into it, it really makes it difficult to really understand the data later because you're like, oh, it's got to be this way. This is the problem. And then when your data doesn't show that, it shows something else, then you adapt and change, right? So being agile about it, being open to new understandings of the data, the patterns is really important because people come in with preconceived notions. And I was on this little, Kenneth, I see you joined, and we'll jump to you in a second here. Kenneth from California. And I know that, Andrew, you and I have talked about how dirty data can be. And that a lot of times, people pull in their data in their Excel spreadsheets and they look at it and people have typed in all kinds of different categories. And you're like, how do I, what do I do? This is so dirty. I can't make sense of anything because everybody's named it different things, right? So, and I know, Andrew, we talked about this like a year ago. It's almost like every data set is dirty. It typically, if you have, there's always categories, there's always nulls, there's always parts of the data. And, I enjoy it now and a lot, looking at dirty data sets and how to make patterns out of it. But a lot of people look at it, like my two interns, they looked at it, it's like, dirty data, we can't handle this, right? No, it's like, no. All data has got some dirtiness to it. So that's, if you shift your mindset and you're like, okay, I'm going to tackle this and clean up this data, that'll help a lot too. And then, I use M, and maybe you guys use something different, but in Power BI, M is the kind of the macro language that goes in and does the conditional statements and cleans everything up. But maybe we go through real quick and see if you guys have run into that, how you handle really, really dirty data, and any recommendations for the audience. And then we'll go to Kenneth for his tips. So Andrew, maybe we start with you, and have you run into a really dirty data set, and how do you overcome that obstacle?
Oh yeah. So my favorite go-to is Twitter data. I love just the availability of just a wide breadth of topics. It's really easy to get a bunch of data, but it's so messy because people don't. I mean, if you just look at English tweets, you're going to get misspellings. You're going to be getting contractions where they're missing the apostrophe. People do capitalization all weird. Sometimes there's not even any text. It's just an image. And the text you want is actually in the image. So like there's so many different ways you can try to wrangle good, high quality information out of this large fire hose of low quality data. But so just from a natural language processing techniques, there's, just getting rid of as much data as you possibly can. So start by making everything lowercase and throwing out tweets if they just don't have any text in it, because you don't want to mess with OCR right off the bat, optical character recognition. I think if you're doing stuff other than natural language processing, kind of like the more business data like we've been talking about, the thing I mentioned at the beginning, that my top tip applies to this as well. If you've got a bunch of categorical data, one of the best things you can do is just get a count on how many categories there are, say like paint colors or something, and how many times that category appears. Because just doing that process, you're going to find out that there's a misspelling if you ever have like a human entered process for that data. And being able to identify all of those sort of, they should be combined together, going through that process at the very beginning and coming up with kind of your exceptions list to bring that stuff together. That's a really good starting point.
So no, that's I have a follow-up comment on that. And then Deepali asked you, what are you using to source data from Twitter? If you can answer that real quick.
Yeah, I've used two approaches. My least favorite now is actually scraping. I think it's a great thing for people to learn Python through and learn the process of web scraping because it's going to come across your desk at some point.
Yeah.
But right now I'm using the Twitter API. So you get developer access and things become dead simple.
No, that's fascinating because I know there's a lot of interest. People have asked me, because Twitter has become a kind of a search engine. YouTube is becoming a search engine now. It's the second largest. Facebook is everything. All the social media platforms are really becoming search engines now, and you can type in terms. And so, this is going to be important in the future. Is how do we scrape and pull the data and organize the data? That's and like you said, these are interesting data sets because they are very, very dirty. Everybody,
they're real time and they have so much context that they can provide to your other applications. So it's a really interesting one.
If you're looking to do sentiment analysis, Twitter is where it's at. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. If you want to get an idea of how people feel, go to those platforms because there's never a lack of someone telling the world how they feel. So
no, it's got emotion, it's got intent, it's got but people just spell and word it differently. So how do you get that in normalized so you can analyze it, right?
And you gotta detect bots.
Yeah. And so that reminds me of the work I did, with Deepali even on analyzing Indeed, kind of job descriptions, because that's the same thing. People word, even though the description is Power BI data analyst or something, there's a whole description field and people word and want different skills and the intent is often the same, but how do you get the intent and the skill sets extracted from that data field, right? So that was super interesting for me when I went through that exercise.
Have you sold that idea yet, Charles?
No, I need to. I have a lot of interest in that, but Deepali and I are still working on it. She's still developing that.
I better see that patent application coming out soon.
It's got a lot of value because people are looking for jobs and they want to know what companies are looking for. So this really brought it the light today. It's like, here, this is the skill set. If you want this job, go learn these things and you can apply for this and check all the boxes. It was phenomenal. And Nick is chiming in. He said, all data is a little bit dirty, pragmatic advice, and helps me set aside more time for my tasks. So it's true. So Nick is chiming in, and we were just on a call with him. So another tip. So my process is, I take the data, I cut and paste, transpose it. I look at each field. And Andrew, that reminded me what you just said is inside of Power BI, I typically bring in the full data set as a flat file first. So that's typically how it comes. And then I pull each field into the canvas and I do a count. So I can see each type of word. And then, I sort for the number of counts of each category. And what that does for me is it really tells me which ones are lookup tables because you've got a million lines of code, but you pull in a count and you see only like 10 categories. And then there's, million is broken down into here's 100,000 in this category. And you're like, okay, this is a lookup table because it's a category categorizing the transactions. So I pull in every single field and I analyze, how many categories, what's the count in each. And that gives me an idea of, moving forward with the data model. And it also shows me which categories are dirty, in terms of spellings and misspellings, and maybe two categories should really be lumped together, stuff like that. So that's a great reminder. And that's a great tip for the audience too, is before you start, marching into your data, sometimes it's good to just look at the counts and categories and pull them into, like a canvas on Power BI or any other tool. So, Tyler, so we'll go to you. And one thing I want to add is I just worked on this the other day is when you're trying to build keys between two tables, the lookup table and dimensional table, a lot of the legacy systems have trailing zeros.
Interesting.
I pull these things in and I was like, nothing's matching. And it was invisible to my eye. And when I finally looked at the data somewhere else, I was like, there's trailing and leading zeros, and those will throw you into fits. And case sensitive. Another one is, like you said, Andrew, lowercase everything and find the matches first, then move into your analysis. So Tyler, any experience from you? Any tips on if you get a dirty data set, what you've done, or any tricks?
Luckily, I haven't had to deal with a lot of categorical data, but I think a lot of the cleaning for me actually was looking at how do I combine various data sources to actually fill in the blanks, right? So if there's a particularly interesting feature that I want to be able to model off of, and I don't have a lot of good representation in the data, there are often ways to interpolate that information and pull it either from other data sources or other columns within the data set. And there are really cool things that you can do with Python and Tableau or Power BI to be able to fill in those missing values so that you can create interesting features or features that are good predictors. You have to be careful with it because you don't want to interpolate too much and end up adding too much assumption. But I think a lot of my data has been relatively clean. There's been times where I've looked at data that, insinuates a semi-tractor trailer could be traveling at 7,000 miles per hour. That is particularly interesting to deal with. And I mean, a lot of that can come out with, or at least be highlighted by looking at your outliers, right? And making sure that if you have a lot of outliers in your data set, you really try and understand what those are.
That's a great point. And Kenneth probably had to drop off because I think he said he had a call, but that's his primary goal is the control charts and looking for the outliers. And I think that's a great tip for anybody that's new with data, is to pull them into a chart, look at the average, look at standard deviations, and really find the ones that are way out and look for a reason why, because there's probably a good reason that they are an outlier or somebody keyed them in wrong. And you could look for the sources of, why that data is way off. And then Sheri just mentioned, she uses clean and trim in Power BI to get rid of those zeros, leading zeros, and get the data. Yeah, so there's some functions built into Power BI to help it. So, Andrew, did you go ahead? Go ahead.
Secondarily, I almost forgot what I was gonna say. I think what also is a good method as well is to really kind of utilize your own capability to look at like what can happen logically in the world, right? Like if there's something that is physically impossible that you have an ability to measure and kind of clean out, look for the things that are very obvious that you don't need to include in the data set or you need to fix. Like most analysts and most people are fairly intelligent, and there are just some pieces of data that stick out like a sore thumb, and really start to key in on those, because it's those little successes in finding those things that will kind of propel you when the real data cleaning gets tough.
Yeah. No, the small wins, if you can find those first, and that's why I like the outliers too. Those are easier to find. Or the categories, the dirty data. Once you start seeing that, it's like, oh, those leading zeros, and you get rid of it, these little small wins, and then you put the data together and you're like, and then you can start seeing the patterns. Yeah, the small wins really, really help. And I love that agile method, being adaptive, and figuring out new insights and moving forward. So yeah, we're up at 48 minutes again. This is amazing. Every time we get you guys together. It
talk all day.
Yeah, we go all over the place. But so maybe we'll end with we're gonna go back again. Think back, and we'll go Andrew and then Tyler. But think back to when you first started analyzing data and looking at patterns and getting into Python. And were there obstacles that made you almost say, maybe this is not the right path. Maybe Python is too hard, maybe, or was, put yourself in somebody else's shoes that's learning Python or Power BI or anything. And you're like, is this worth it? Should I continue this path? Because I remember when I first started, looking at errors at Power BI, the error messages are terrible. You read it as like code free C, and you're like, how am I ever going to figure this error out? And I almost quit, right? Or the first time it crashed on me, I'm like, one of the issues I saw was when I first connected to a SQL server, a Snowflake schema, and I just clicked select all, and it pulled every single table in, and it just crashed out the eye, right? And I thought to myself, maybe this is not the path for me. Right? So, but then I learned you just click the one table that you really need, or maybe a couple, and then bring those in, then analyze that, right? So I want you to stretch your brain, go back. Were there any obstacles, and what you overcame to, and maybe somebody in the audience has been through the similar thing, right? Similar situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that I had to overcome when I was starting to get into applying these data analysis techniques to business data is that my background is from engineering. I was an electrical engineer. And the types of systems that I would traditionally work with machine learning and my other forms of analysis, it was always on engineered systems where, you have noise in the data, but you can characterize the noise with like additive white Gaussian noise, or you could color that noise a little bit, or, we had distributions to describe the variation that we saw in the data set, and being able to characterize that allowed you to make tons of simplifications. And then it was almost a mechanical process from there. When you get into business data, it's not an engineered system. It's kind of an ad hoc process put together with people's ideas, figuring out how do we make this business run, and data gets entered at different rates that can be unpredictable. And it's just, if you try to approach things from that strict engineering mindset where you're going to be able to like bend the data to your will and like know things with certainty, you're going to have a hard time. And I did have a hard time with that for a while. The phrase good enough was a swear word in my vocabulary when it came to data, coming from the engineering perspective. But once you start getting into this iterative process of working with data and saying, you know what, this is our understanding right now, we're going to just ship it and figure out what we can learn from when it goes well and when it doesn't go well, and always be looking for those outliers and turning that into a learning experience instead of an engineered experience was the major mind shift that I had to do when I was jumping into the data world.
So Andrew, like I'm an electrical engineer too, right? And then I went for my MBA, and I'm going to be honest, I almost dropped out of the MBA because I was like, what is this stuff? What is depreciation, and how can you pick different paths for everything? And it's not just like black and white anymore. In engineering, right. Black and white, and everything is so gray in business, and you can come up with different solutions and processes and stuff. So, that fear crept into my mind when I started doing Power BI. I'm like, I'm an electrical engineer, I'm a systems engineer, I'm project manager. What business do I have doing DAX and M and queries and SQL and all this stuff? So that is a definite fear. And I was just talking to Avi Singh the other day about this stuff. And I think, that for me, just the realization that all these experiences are an advantage in data analytics, because you come from the engineering side where you bring in your problem solving skills. And I had a little bit of the MBA business, which was brought in the business side, because data, I think before, was always in the IT world where, it was dim tables and it was, Snowflake schema, and it was all about building the relational database in terms that nobody understood. And it took a long time to build these relational tables. But the business world, you need the decision right now today, and you got to move forward to make impact and value. And so that's where it became an advantage for me, because from project management world, I was dealing with business decisions all the time. And now I was coupling it with this data pattern recognition side of things. So I had to shift my mind and not be so afraid of, moving into a new area, changing my identity, but, kind of embracing it as kind of a coupling of two worlds or three worlds: engineering, project management, and then the IT and DAX programming world, right? So no, that's a great one. And then the fear of shipping it.
Yeah, you don't want to be wrong, right? Like, it sometimes feels like your credibility or I guess just identity is on the line when you say, hey, here's this system that you've been wanting us to put together, and it's going to be telling you things that you want it to do, and it's going to be wrong sometimes. And you don't want it to ever be wrong, but it's going to be, and you just got to be okay with that.
Right. That is so scary. Like, you have this data head site, you have these new insights. You're like, oh, maybe this is what's broken in the company. But if you present that, will that, group that has, their process needs to change, will they get upset? There's all these fears. You're like, oh, I have all these insights and I want to share them to make the company better, but will it step on somebody's toes too? So there's there's the fear of that, which is, no, this is great insight. So thank you for that, Andrew. And then, so Tyler, we're gonna end with you. So yeah, think back to when you were getting into BI, when you were looking at all this stuff, and what fears, what roadblocks, what came into your brain and said, maybe this isn't the right path, and maybe you should try something else, and it could be technical, or it could be, some of these emotional human things that we experience.
Yeah, I mean, so when I first started to get into data analytics and dashboarding and things of that nature, I had first started working at GM, and we were just trying to understand simple throughput. That was really all it was. Yeah. And be able to demonstrate throughput on a basic visualization. And we'd spent hours and hours going to various systems, downloading reports, putting it all into Excel, then cramming it into Tableau to build just a very basic dashboard. And I hated it. It was terrible. I really like to pride myself on efficiency and doing things and having it being automated. And that's kind of what started my journey down this path, was not wanting to do things over and over and over and over again that take a lot of time. And I think the biggest hurdles that I had to overcome were mostly self-imposed, not wanting to spend the extra hours going out onto Stack Overflow or something like that to go learn a concept. You guys have had some really great discussions before on building your tribe, and I had to learn how to surround myself with people that could help me, because I never would have been able to learn it on my own, all of it on my own. I've had you guys, I've had she was a godsend. Her name was Pungodi, and she was where I learned SQL from. And I know I annoyed the crap out of her because I had so many questions, and I was like, why couldn't this be like some declarative programming where I didn't have to type out real SQL syntax? And I was never very good at logic in high school. So it just took a lot of self-motivation to be like, you will get this. Again, focus on your little wins, focus on the things that you can control. And like I said, surround yourself with people that care about you and want to be able to help. And most people want to help other people. There's very few evil people out there that just don't want to help you. And so if you're getting into this, know that there is a steep learning curve in the beginning, but find your tribe, the people that you can surround yourself with that can help you through the hurdles and teach you and spend the extra 20 to 30 minutes talking about how they can help and explaining things. So I think SQL is the best place to start if you're getting into this, and then work from there and build on it. So that's probably that was my struggles in the early game.
Mine too. I didn't learn any SQL until I got out of the engineering side and more on the business data side. And there's a learning curve there.
Yep. That's the same with me. In engineering, I never learned it. And then when it was actually MBA, I just had to fill an elective slot, and I took a database class, and that's, and I fell in love with SQL, the beauty of it. But I also saw its inefficiencies. So, some of the convoluted stuff you have to do with SQL just to get the query right. So these are all great insights. And then, Tyler, I think what hits home with me is, being able to, at some point, I think the biggest obstacle for me was to say, okay, I can learn from other people. And as an engineer, I think you want to learn everything yourself. But there's so many resources, so many people that can help and make you move faster. There's an advantage to getting other people to help you, because you can move faster and learn more faster than just trying to do it all by yourself. But the fear I had to overcome was, if I post a question that seemed like a beginner, like a stupid question on, any of the forums, you're scared of being judged, right? And what I've found is, since Power BI and AI and machine learning are so new in general, we're all kind of battling these things, right? So you find that there's a lot of support for learning for somebody trying to get into it, because we all just went through this recently. It's not like anybody's been doing it for 20 years. We're all kind of new to it.
Well, and the data profession's so broad too, and people are coming into it from a wide variety of backgrounds. So not having a fundamental skill set like SQL for me is kind of expected, because I didn't need that from the path that I came from. But now that I'm starting to get into a different area of the data profession, now that skill's highly relevant. So that's a hard fear to get over.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, I'm just going to end on, wow, an hour and 2 minutes. Thanks, guys. We're gonna wrap it up and do a quick recap show. But I remember, and I see this, and there's probably audience members today that will experience this, but Excel is such a go-to. And I think it's because it's been around a long time. Everybody has it on their computer, and it's so easy to revert back and say, oh, I can do this in Excel. So why would I do it? And I hear this almost every week still. There's people that want to revert to Excel, and it's a change. It's a mind shift into how Power BI, how data model, how Star Schema, understanding queries, SQL. It's a change, because everything I think, and you guys can kind of chime in, but you have a flat file. You understand the relationships in a flat file. You don't have to do a line up to a relationship, one to many, to another table, and then to a sub table, right? It's all right there. It's all visible. VLOOKUP, you say, okay, I'm looking this up somewhere else, and I'm just going to pull that in. Super simple to understand. But, that nested if statements, if this, I can understand. If this, then go to that. But then when you have one of those break, or, you have your data sets gets too large and your computer starts crashing, or you end up, I think, Tyler, you talked about this, doing something over and over and over, like that, the steps in M now that automate the cleaning. When you can automate and clean everything just by, writing some code, that has been the biggest shift for me is, and I fell into this trap. It's like, I can do this in Excel, so I'm just going to go back to that. Or I was building models in Power BI, but I was keeping an Excel thing in the background, right? Now I shifted into everything in Power BI. So I don't know if you guys have seen that kind of, the reversion back to Excel. Python is hard.
I do it. I do it. I mean, there are just times where Pandas doesn't cut it. And I need to go back to the Excel file and be like, what in the world is going on here? And where are these nulls that I can't understand where they're at? It's just, there's this weird trade-off where you have to get used to doing everything with your fingers, right? With code. And that's like a big jump sometimes when everything's very visual in Excel, right? Because it's click and type a few things. It's not the same when you're working with a coding language or even with SQL, right? So it's a big jump, and sometimes I have to revert back, and but sometimes it's okay. I'm a visual learner, so sometimes I just have to kind of give in and be efficient about it and go, dump it to Excel, figure out what you need to figure out, and then you're fine. So
no, that's true. I still do a blend like that transpose. I do that in Excel before I put it into Power BI. So you can do a blend. It's not out of the realm of it's possible to blend the two and use both as tools to help you get to the end goal, which is insights from the data. So, Andrew, any other obstacles you see from people? Do you see people reverting to certain things? Is that one of the obstacles you're seeing? Well,
I could tell you specifically what I find myself reverting to all the time. It's kind of deep in the weeds, but PANDAS stores things in columns.
Yeah.
And I think of things in rows. And so I often will fight PANDAS and how I want to express stuff, kind of like what you said, fighting stuff in SQL, just trying to get the query right.
Yeah.
And I will very consistently fall back to using Python generators. So that's just iterating through the PANDAS table to apply the very specific custom function that I want to individual rows. And if Panda was personified, it would be yelling at me saying, "You don't understand how to use me." And I would be screaming back, "This is how I want to do it." Yeah, so maybe a little too deep on the technical side of what I personally revert to all the time. But it works on smaller data sets. When you need to productionize it, it falls apart, and I pay for it later. But we all have our crutches.
Well, that's true. I think that goes along the lines of there's obviously Singh uses the term, and I think this is used elsewhere too, but human-friendly format, where Excel, you've got months and then the year category up top in a merged column or a merged row. And you're like, okay, so, and then you put it in Power BI, and then you got to unpivot and then line everything up. And so there's a human friendly and then machine friendly. And I'm still going through that of converting my brain from human friendly into machine friendly. And I think that's what you're talking about is PANDAS likes machine friendly, not the human friendly stuff. So no, great session. Any last thoughts, guys, or we're going to probably end and
I technically have to get back to work. So.
Oh yeah. You get back to work. But this is
I could do that. If we keep continuing this conversation, it'll be like 3:00 and I'll be like, where'd my day go? My boss will be pinging me.
And it's my God, before Thanksgiving and
I got to work on the turkey. I'm brining that, and we'll do that on the recap. So, all right, bye everybody. Bye. And if you're interested, write in the comments that you want to hear about my turkey brining issues. But we're going to end this podcast right now. So, thanks for tuning in. We had a lot of comments today. And, if you have questions, I want to bring this group back because we can go on for hours and we should probably stop right now. So, bye, everyone.
See ya.